We are going to start off the opening theory part of this video by first looking over some of White's less critical tries. So after e4... Sorry about that, the Dell webcam is trying to mess me up. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e5. I should preface this by saying when I say our less critical tries, we're going to start our coverage after 3 f5, because White does have other options after opening e4. You can play the Scotch or the King's Gambit or the Italian game. There's a million of those, but that, while very interesting and important to know if you're playing the Schliemann, it will be outside the scope of this video. It's possible that I'll do another DVD on that stuff later, but for now we're just going to stick to the Schliemann. So one of the biggest appeals of the Schliemann is there aren't really that many sidelines White can choose from. He can't just kind of play nonsense and try to get you out of your comfort zone, because if he's too complacent, White can very quickly end up worse. So I've seen people castle here, but it's senseless. After f takes e4, Black's doing great. Bishop c6, and there's plenty of good moves, but I prefer to take with the d-pawn, and then go knight f6. And I see no problem at all with Black's position. He has a bishop pair on an open board. The e4 pawn is isolated, but it's very likely that White will have to trade it, because when you play bishop d6, he's probably going to have to play d4 or f4 to defend the knight, and then you'll just exchange off the pawns. Already, I would prefer to be Black. I think the bishop pair on the open board will be pretty nice, and he's got a... Looks like he may end up ahead in development when White moves this knight on e5 for a third time, and Black was able to make a recapturing move d takes c6 to open up the bishop on c8. That's not critical at all. I think it's very unlikely he'll have any opportunity to face it over the board. More likely is if other sidelines you'll see. Occasionally you'll see someone grab on c6, but similarly I think this is unimpressive after d takes c6, knight takes e5. There's plenty of good moves for Black. I think the simplest is just knight f6. And after something like this, you can start with bishop d6 or bishop takes f5. In either case, I think Black has pretty good typical Schliemann counterplay. This is not the only option, but I think it's more than sufficient. And finally, if e takes f5, this is just really senseless. This is the only one where I think Black's already just better. After e4, this knight on f3 is really just out of place. It has nowhere home to go to, so this is really problematic for him. So of those sidelines, though, the only really serious one is d4, and Black does need to be prepared for this move, because it's interesting. White's trying to instigate immediate conflict in the center, and if Black's unprepared, he can come under some pressure, but I believe with some good moves, Black can very quickly get a position he'll enjoy. So we're going to take on e4. Now knight takes e5, knight e5, d5, c6. And here the best move is knight c3, sacrificing a piece. But first we're going to see what happens if White tries to save his bishop. Let's say he plays bishop e2, which was actually played in a game by Judith Polgar once. Black will go queen i5 check, and the Polgar game continued. Bishop d2, queen e5, bishop c3. Okay, White has lost a central pawn, but her point is that she's leading in development. Queen g5, and now White played bishop h5 check, with the idea that g6 is not possible on account of the hanging rook in the corner. So White's trying to play for an initiative for the pawn, but for this, I don't believe in it. Essentially, the Black king is perfectly safe in the center. He'll be able to play d5, and then c4 is not really on the cards because White's bishop is in the way, and Black can go bishop d6, knight f6, hide the king on c7. At some point, I think this is basically just a pawn. And indeed, the game will continue to believe g3, d5, and Black soon played knight f6, and already the computer's going nuts for Black's position. Polgar did end up winning the game, but I think this had much more to do with the receptive strength of the players in the opening. I think already Black can be very comfortable with this position. Similarly, after c6, if White were to look for another bishop retreat, okay, let's say bishop c4, which looks the most active, trying to put pressure. After queen a5 check, and let's say a similar bishop d2, not queen takes d2, my mouse is obnoxious, queen takes e5. This time Black will just get d5 with tempo in addition. I don't think White's ever going to take on g8, and even if he is, it's certainly not something Black should be afraid of. And again, after something similar, bishop c3, queen g5, here White doesn't even have the bishop h5 check resource to make the Black king move. So pretty soon, like basically next move, I think Black's just going to play d5, the White bishop will retreat, and then we'll play knight f6, bishop d6, castle, Black will be up a central pawn, the game's basically over. So if White can't really play this move d4 on move 4, I mean by just trying to play calmly. And when he plays this, he's got to accept that he's going to be playing a more aggressive game and has to take some serious risks to justify this play. So instead, after c6, the best move is knight c3, aiming to sacrifice a piece, which we're not going to complain about capturing. So c takes b5, knight takes e4. We see the point of white's play. It's he's down a piece, but his stuff is coming out very fast, and it's hard for black to develop properly. Basically, this knight is completely stuck. If knight h6, we're going to take it. Queen h5 check. Black's already completely busted. If knight e7, the computer doesn't even want to let me play it. Knight e7, we're going to see a very short game. So the knight can't get out. The bishop here is skeptical at best. Bishop e7 would block the knight. This bishop can't get out, so it's a little tough for black to develop his pieces, and that's white's sort of hope for compensation. But at the same time, white doesn't have any meaningful threats yet, and so it's not very surprising that with accurate play, black can claim a fine position. So this is not the computer's first choice, but the move I recommend, which is I think basically the only one that's ever been contested, is the move d5. So black's point with this move is he's just gaining time. He's willing to give a pawn back in order to activate his pieces. So obviously white's not going to move the knight again and just let black get his bishop out to e6 and have no problems. He's going to play e takes d6 en passant. And so white now has picked up a second pawn for the piece, but this bishop on c8 is now free to go out, and more importantly, we can start with the move knight f6, solving the problem of our biggest problem piece, and then we're going to be able to put pressure on the d6 pawn later and hopefully take it back. And if black can achieve that, at some point he will just be up a piece. So white has a few options here. Historically, the most common has been to castle. But here, I think after knight takes e4, queen h5 check, g6, queen e5 check, white gets some material back. But nonetheless, a position like this one, white currently has rook and 2 pawns for bishop and knight, but black's going to take a pawn back, and there's no real problems. So, for example, if white tries to hold this pawn this way, his queen might get trapped very soon. Say bishop e6, keeping everything protected, and already black has a simple threat, queen d7, and then you're not stopping the queen from getting trapped after rook e8 and bishop g7. So probably white will play a move like bishop h6, aiming to pin the bishop to the black queen and try to engineer some exchanges. But after queen takes d6 and say we start taking stuff, I think this endgame should be absolutely fine for black. I don't necessarily think he should be better. Normally you'd prefer the side with the piece, with the 2 pieces over the rook and the pawn. But at this point, the white rooks will be very active, and probably black will not be able to avoid an exchange of rooks. But still, I see absolutely no reason for him to complain. I think if anyone's playing for an edge, it's black, but probably it's pretty close to equal. So this isn't really something that requires a ton of worry. Other moves white can try are a little bit more pressing. You can play queen d4 or queen e2, which will transpose. I think queen e2 is more accurate because after queen d4, in addition to playing knight takes e4, which will transpose to our analysis if white had started with queen e2, black has the additional option to play the move queen e6, which is kind of a funny move, but it has a point that he wants to capture on e4, and then after queen takes e4 check, meet with queen e6. So something like castle takes queen e6. Okay, it looks like black is pretty easily escaping from any attack white is trying to engineer. If the white queen moves away after something like bishop takes d6, it's kind of unfortunate for white that he can't go rook e1. And it looks like very quickly black will castle and just be a piece ahead. So, okay, white has some options after queen d7, but I think black's just clearly better. So a better move order would be queen e2, in which case, I'll call this the main line. I'm going to recommend that we grab on e4, and now king f7. So the king looks a little unsafe, but it's really not much of an issue. If we're able to capture the pawn on d6, we'll be good. So if white were to play a slow move, which is of course ridiculous, and something like castles, we're just going to take on d6. I think black's basically winning with an extra piece. There's no real threats. White has one piece, the queen, who's capable of making threats, and she's not going to deliver checkmate by herself. So that's nothing to be too scared about. White can try queen d5 check. Why my computer keeps clicking in weird places. Let's get a new one. Queen d5 check. And now we will go bishop e6. This position. King f7, queen d5 check here. I'm sorry, my computer's being really obnoxious. Bishop e6, queen takes b7. And white was able to take a third pawn even, but d6 is weak, and even after bishop f4 protecting it, white's underdeveloped. And most importantly, the black king has no problems whatsoever here, so I would prefer to be black already. I think this is quite a comfortable position for him. So the most principled move now is bishop f4. But, and here, this actually makes some sense, because if white is able to castle long and then play rook he1, he's going to solidify the pawn on d6, and that will restrict the bishop on f8, and he'll have some attacking chances, and the bishop on c8 is still trapped and restricted to its role on defending b7. And of course, black is unable to capture this pawn, at least not comfortably, because after queen d5 check, white will get the piece back. Okay, black can try something like bishop e6 here and aim to hold an opposite color bishop endgame down a pawn, but it's not a good pawn structure to do that. I think white's very happy with the extra f-pawn, and okay, I think white has very serious winning chances. Maybe not higher than black's drawing chances, but this is not really the kind of position that I'm aiming to get in the repertoire I'm presenting to you guys here. So instead of that, I'm going to recommend the move queen e8, which I think is very strong. If black's able to exchange the queens, a lot of his problems will go away, and that's entirely our goal. So if we take and say castle long, there's still some nominal compensation for the moment for white, because we've got he's got this pawn on d6 that's restricting black's pieces, but still, after just a simple move like bishop d7, rook he1 check, king f7, white doesn't really have threats, and soon enough this bishop on f8 will come out to g7, and probably our next move will be rook e8 to engineer some exchanges, and I really don't think white has enough for a piece here with the queens off the board. I mean, it'd be one thing if we could take this h7 pawn and migrate it to g6, and at the same time take the h2 pawn and migrate it to g5. Then really the black bishop on f8 would be a spectator. But as is, it has a route into the game. There are open files for black to exchange pieces. I think that the extra piece looks pretty nice here. So yeah, this is pretty comfortable for black. Instead, white could try the move bishop e5, which is the computer's main suggestion, and it makes sense. Again, we're trying to keep more pieces on the board and not exchange queens. And again, we see that the tempting move you'd like to play, bishop takes d6, fails the queen d5 check, or white will get his piece back and remain a pawn ahead. But we can just play simple. I'm going to recommend the move queen c6 to put more pressure on white and try to get the pieces out to natural squares. We weren't ready to move the bishop on c8 yet because b7 was hanging. But after something like this, let's say white gives a check, king g8, castle long, and bishop e6. With the bishop on f8, it's a little passive, but it defends the key g7 points, and in the meantime, black's other pieces are pretty good, and he doesn't really have any problems with the king. He can try to engineer some queenside play, and I think at some point black's extra piece will play. I don't really believe in white's attack here. I think it should be very promising for black. So none of this stuff is wildly challenging, but still, it's good to get the key sidelines out of the way, because there's really nothing more annoying when you're preparing an opening, to go over all the main lines and come up with some really nice analysis, and then when someone plays a sideline that you've never seen before and you make one mistake, you just die. That's a very unsatisfying way to lose at chess, because you feel like you've done the work needed to play this opening, and then instead you just lose right away because you didn't do the work in the place that, well, your opponent was working. Even if it was objectively not the best, it was enough to mess you up. And here, I think with this presented repertoire, we've basically covered all of white's available sidelines. Once we've reached the bishop e5, f5 position, of course, there's still other ways he can play e4, e5. They're not the Roy Lopez. But once he's committed to bishop b5, which is the most challenging move, we've, I think, now covered all the key sidelines that black will have to worry about when playing the Schliemann defense. So the next thing we're going to move on to are the main lines, and covering those in a bit more detail than we saw here, because this stuff isn't so critical. In any case, until our next meeting, enjoy the analysis.
This is Grandmaster Damian Lemos here for OnlineChessLessons.net. First of all, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like to receive more free chess videos from us, you can just click the subscribe button below. I would also highly recommend signing up for my free mail course, the 10 Grandmaster Secrets to Dominate Chess. During this exclusive course from OnlineChessLessons.net, I'll share with you my own Grandmaster shortcuts to effective attacking, defending, and growth hacks to improving your chess without complicated books or memorization. So sign up by clicking the sidebar on the right, and I know you won't be disappointed. Once more, this is Damian for OnlineChessLessons.net, and I'll see you in my videos. Thank you.